You once said in an interview, poker is one of the few sports where a woman can compete on a totally equal footing with a man. So I don't understand why there's a ladies-only tournament.
Right.
So are you totally against ladies-only tournaments still?
Basically, I'm against ladies-only tournaments that involve things like bracelets and trophies.
Okay.
And the reason why, and you know, one thing that's really interesting about that comment that I made is that some people really misinterpret it and say that I don't support women in poker. And that really frustrates me because that statement is a big support for women in poker. And what that statement is that when you separate people out in sort of some sort of competition,
Right.
the only reason why you would ever separate people out is because of something being significantly different in the thing that thing measures,
Okay.
right? So tennis, for example. Women can't play tennis against men on a fair playing field because tennis is measuring physical strength and agility, and we know that men are stronger than we are by about 20%. So basically, we'd be laying them 10-8 every time we tried to play, which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
So we need to separate them out. It totally makes sense. Soccer, any of those physical sports, it completely makes sense for women to be competing separately from men. So here's the problem. What exactly does poker measure?
No, it's a mind game.
It's a mind game. So you're measuring something, intellectual agility, cognitive skills, something like that. And so the fact that you're saying, look, we're going to have a separate tournament that's just for women, the only way that you would have that is if you feel like there's significant difference in the intelligence and the cognitive skills of a woman versus a man as it relates to poker.
Mm-hmm.
So basically they're saying that women are dumb,
Right.
or at least not as smart as men
really
are.
you're on the women's side.
Of course.
It's not.
And the way that I always point that out, by the way, interestingly enough, I'm not against seniors events. Because we know that as you get older, your cognitive skills degrade.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually is a case where probably what you're measuring is probably a little bit worse, right? But what I tell people all the time is, how would you feel about an African-American only tournament? If the World Series announced next year that they were going to have an African-American only bracelet event,
flip.
they would flip out. And they would flip out because they'd say, what are you saying about blacks?
Right.
Are you saying they're not as smart as white people? And it's really interesting to me that people can see that so clearly when you make it a race issue.
But not gender.
But they can't see it when you make it a gender issue. You know, and the great thing is I've gotten 2 answers when I've complained about that event. Answer number 1 is it's a tradition. And you know what? Women not voting for a long time was a tradition. Women not being able to own property was a tradition for a long time. Women not being welcome in the workforce. That was a tradition for a long time. You know what was a tradition also? Minstrel shows, where whites would put blackface on and make fun of black people. Like, there are lots of things that have been traditions in this country. Like, tradition is not a reason to continue to do something if you decide that it's wrong. The other answer that I've gotten, which is very telling and very disturbing to me as a woman, is that people say, but everybody knows that bracelet doesn't count. And honestly, I've gotten that from people in the organization.
Wow.
Where I've said, why do you still have this as a bracelet?
So why even do
event?
it?
Well, that's the issue, right? So, you know, they're like, well, that everybody knows that bracelet doesn't count. I'm like, But see, and then I say to them, but that's the problem.
Right.
That's the problem with the event. You're discounting the fact that all they've done is beat a bunch of women. That's what you're saying by saying that bracelet doesn't count. It's like crazy to me. You know, the thing that I don't have a problem with is I wouldn't play in them, but if a casino has like a ladies' night or something like that,
Sure.
I mean, I guess they can go ahead and do that. As a woman, I wouldn't play in that because I still find it insulting. But I understand that a lot of women are intimidated to come into the poker world, and maybe they feel more comfortable getting into it if they're playing with a bunch of their friends or whatever it might be. I understand that there's some other motives for that. So I'm not going to really take a strong stance either way on some random, like, hey, let's introduce some women to poker. And I actually teach a ladies-only camp because I know from, also this is true in schooling, that women actually learn better if they're among women. So if you're in a teaching environment, it's fine to say, okay, if you want to come just learn with women, that's great. Because what I'm going to do is, when I do the ladies-only camps, I say, if I'm going to take this strong stance about women's-only tournaments, what I'm going to do is give you the tools so that you're not intimidated and you can feel like you're better than the other people in the tournament. So you'll go in and you'll play tournaments and realize that you can compete against anybody in the world, and you don't need to discount your own abilities, right? Because I'm going to give you the tools to have great abilities. So that's why I do those ladies camps. Because I have people sometimes be like, why are you against ladies tournaments?
But you're doing
ladies only camps. It's like, because that's an educational thing. I'm not giving a world championship for camps. right?
That makes sense.
So that's the issue that I have. I fear that it won't happen, but I really wish that the ladies tournament would go away.
All right, Ante Up for Africa.
Yep.
You co-founded that charity.
Yep.
In 2006. What motivated you for that particular cause?
Well, first of all, I know how amazing poker is as a fundraising tool. So I thought, I want to do something which is really mainly based on the idea that the poker community is so generous. And I'm really big on, and this is something that I really talk to my kids about a lot, really, I get very passionate about causes that have to do with people who don't have a way to speak for themselves, who are born into circumstances where they can't better themselves. Because one of the things that we really take for granted in America is that our government will protect us, that our government is going to do what it can to make sure that we all have equal opportunity. And through accident of birth, where we ended up living geographically, we feel like that. Like, we feel like we all have equal access to education. And, I mean, we don't have exactly equal access, but we feel like we can grab it if we want to. And that whatever happens when we send our children out, the government isn't gonna prevent us from being able to keep our children safe. They're going to try to facilitate our abilities to keep our children safe. The thing about refugees is that they've been disenfranchised by their own government, and often chased out by their own government. In the case of Darfur, their own government has killed 400,000 of those people. And then there's over 2 million people who have been displaced by their own government. And then the places that they end up, they're disenfranchised as well, because the new countries don't give them any voice. They're not citizens. They're not anything. And so, these people don't have the luxury of, like, self-actualization or, like, any of that stuff. They're literally like, where do I get water? Where do I get food? What am I going to do? And when you look at, like, they can't, much less keeping their children safe, they need to figure out a way to shelter their children.
Yeah.
So, I always think, like, it's amazing. When I send my kids to school, I just take for granted that they're safe there. And you have, like, for example, some of the refugee situation in Iraq right now where people can't send their children to school because there's bombs in the schools. So how do you, as a parent, deal with that? And you have these refugees that are in Chad, who've been pushed out of Darfur, and they don't have roofs over their head. They have no way to know if they can't get their children medicine. They can't get their children proper nourishment. Like, as a parent, like, think how horrible it is. And they have no voice. So, obviously we have so much here, and whatever we can do in terms of raising money to give those people a voice, to try to help speak for those people because they have no other access. I think that you have an obligation to do that. I mean, I really do. And it's amazing to me because I have people say to me, like, don't you care about America? I'm like, well, I mean, aside from the stuff that I do for American charities, because I'm very involved with, like, Children's Hospital of Boston. I'm on the board of Decision Education Foundation, which is an educational foundation to improve decision-making skills in kids in America, and Make-A-Wish and all those things. I look at them and I'm like, the border around America is completely arbitrary.
Right.
It's like there are people, like, drew lines on a map. I mean, how can you... I understand that we have economic issues here right now, but our problems are so high class compared to what's going on over there. And if you start judging, what you should care about by these arbitrary borders, like that there's an us and a them, which is really what they're saying, that we have us and then there's them, and why are you helping them and not helping us? How tight do you make that? Like, are people in California not supposed to help Katrina victims?
Right.
Because there's an arbitrary border around there, too. We drew something on a map around California. If there was an earthquake in San Francisco, should people in L.A. not care? Because, again, there's an arbitrary border there. It's like when you start paying attention to those kinds of arbitrary borders, you're being very exclusive as opposed to inclusive. And I know what the actual border is, that we're this rock that's floating around the sun and we all live on it, and we should care about everything that's happening around the earth.
So how much did the charity aspect have to do with the decision to be on Celebrity Apprentice?
It was the only reason I did it. So what happened was that my manager had sort of been wanting to get me on one of these reality shows, like Dancing with the Stars or whatever. And I'm a terrible dancer, so I think the only person worse than me was, like, Phil Hellmuth. But
oh, God.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. So I really was very against it. So he called me up one day. He goes, I got you a meeting with the executive producers of Celebrity Apprentice, and you should have heard me on the phone with him. I was really pissed off. And, I was like, I told you I didn't want to do one of these reality shows. Anyway, so he said to me, please go take the meeting, and you can say no after you take the meeting. And that was the deal that we struck, because he was like,